I can also remember a specific moment where I went camping with the two of them by myself and our van was broken. So I borrowed a big tent from a friend that I didn't know how to set up. That was, it was pouring with rain. I didn't check the weather forecast. I tried to bring washable diapers. Mika was like 9 months old. He was like eating rocks and, everything was a total disaster. It was literally disaster. And at one point, Matthias was in the tent and he was like jumping against the nylon. You could see the imprint of a 2-year-old. He was just melting down. And I had to like put a nylon wall between us for just a minute. And I was like, they're not even going to remember this. Like, what's going on? Why am I doing this?
Hey folks, thank you for tuning in to the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast. Today's guest is an alpinist, mountain guide, and mother, and the subject of a new 3-part film series from the team at Patagonia titled Parenting Disaster Style. Pulled from the vocabulary of climbers, disaster style is all about giving it everything you've got. It's hard, messy, and adventurous, with some risk in pursuit of big rewards. Zoe Hart asks what it would be like to bring that approach to the world of parenting, where risk looks more like a 25-hour flight with a child that's only a handful of months old than climbing a high-grade pitch in nasty weather. This episode is incredibly enjoyable as we hear Zoe tell stories of both the good and the bad of parenting disaster style, as well as how she accidentally fell in love with her kids and how they are working together today on a shared passion for environmental activism. Whether you are a parent or not, I think you can really enjoy Zoe's perspective and can take some learnings from the lessons she's experienced firsthand, both the good and the not so good. After you listen to this episode, please make sure to head over to ecosystemmember.com, where you can find links to watch the film series, as well as a really beautiful piece that Zoe wrote for Yeti titled Finding Refuge. Huge thanks to Zoe for taking time to chat and for her transparency. As a soon-to-be parent myself, many of these questions were as much out of my personal interest as they are out of the public interest. And as always, if you are watching on YouTube, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the Ecosystem Member channel. Or if you're listening on Apple Podcast or Spotify, leave us a 5-star review. The more of you who do that, the more likely the platforms are to make sure people find the podcast and to think a little bit more about their own relationship with nature. Without further delay, here is the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast with Zoe Hart. Today on the Ecosystem Member Podcast, I am really stoked to be joined by Zoe Hart, mother, mountain guide, and activist. Thanks for joining us today, Zoe.
Thanks for having me.
So one of the reasons that we had you on the podcast is this new film series that's coming out that you've made with your family and with Patagonia, Parenting Disaster Style. When I was watching the videos and the film series, you introduced the first episode of the film series explaining the origin of disaster style. So maybe can you share that story here quickly and how you're bringing that to parenting and like your role as a mother?
Yeah, I mean, disaster style is it's a phrase used by alpinists, and what it means is you kind of throw everything at something, you go for it. It's usually pretty heinous. There's usually a lot of suffering, but then there's often success afterwards. And it kind of goes into the bucket of type 1 and type 2 fun. So, we call that type 2 fun, where it's fun afterwards. It's maybe not that fun while you're doing it. And so the long story, which I haven't actually gotten into in the film, is that a friend of mine, Steve House, who's a very high-level alpinist, was introducing me to mutual friends and talking about his parenting style and mine. And he was basically like, Zoe was an alpinist, but she basically took disaster style into her parenting strategies. And I took it as a compliment. You could maybe see it as a criticism, and I know that wasn't what he was trying to say, but it really kind of resonated. And the goal is not to have a disaster, but the goal is really just that along with disaster comes beauty and growth. And so accepting that process in climbing, and really those kind of days in the mountains are the most vivid memories of my 20s and 30s and really growing and learning. And so I guess that's how it translated into parenting. It wasn't really a conscious decision, but it's just kind of, I guess I live disaster style as well.
Awesome. And people will be able to see this in the film series. But I think now that you explain that type 1 versus type 2, there are definitely some examples in the film series where we see your kids in sort of the type 2 situations of getting through it and making it up. There's also some adorable moments where they've got, like a carabiner with one of their stuffed animals tucked into their belt. So just a couple of examples, like what does parenting disaster style look like? Like, what is there a scenario you can share that brings that to life?
It took us a little while for the kids to understand the value of type 2 fun, to be completely honest. Like we did a lot of outings and they weren't always convinced. But then when we did it, they realized what they learned and what they earned and what they got that other people don't get through that. I remember we took Mika hiking to do a bivouac on a mountain I could see it out my window. It's not that far, but he was little, and I remember telling him, this is really cool because you get something no one else gets. You get to wake up and watch the sunset over the mountains, wake up, see the sunset over the glaciers, and you have this experience. And he was like, not convinced. He was not psyched on that whole idea. He was like, great, Mom, that's awesome. But this hike really is not fun for me, and it's hard and it's long. So we got up there and we ended up sleeping up there and we played cards and my older son was traveling or something. And then we really had the most magical night, and then we went back down, and it was the accumulation of these where they started to recognize afterwards the experience. And Mika's now 11, and he said to me, I've learned that I'm not always motivated to go in the mountains when it's raining in town or to do these things that may not be fun. But I now know that I want to convince myself to do it because it's always worth it afterwards. So he kind of got that, bridged that gap between just purely suffering and enjoying. But on the other side, I also had to learn to kind of reel it in a little bit. When I started doing adventures, it was kind of like I was taking it like as an alpinist. It was always these big and complex and epic adventures. And I can also remember a specific moment where I went camping with the two of them by myself, and our van was broken. So I borrowed a big tent from a friend that I didn't know how to set up. That was, it was pouring with rain. I didn't check the weather forecast. I tried to bring washable diapers. Mika was 9 months old. He was eating rocks, and, everything was a total disaster. It was literally disaster. And at one point, Matthias was in the tent and he was jumping against the nylon. You could see the imprint of a 2-year-old. He was just melting down, and I had to put a nylon wall between us for just a minute. And I was like, they're not even going to remember this. What's going on? Why am I doing this? And I realized that they just wanted to stay in the camp and pick berries and play with pine cones. And I was we were going rock climbing, we were going to go hiking, we were going to do all these things. So I had to learn to adapt, to what was an adventure for them. Otherwise, it is just literally disaster, and it's not the type 2 where you actually have fun afterwards. It's just awful.
Yeah, no, that you painted quite a picture, I think, with that scene that probably many parents listening can relate to. So maybe let's just back up a little bit. What does your family setup look like? Kids, your partner, animals, pets. What does your family setup look like?
So I have 2 sons. They're 18 months apart. Matthias is about to turn 13 now, and Mika's 11. My husband is French Canadian. He's also a mountain guide, but he's an engineer, and he works as the technical director of an outdoor company that builds, technical mountain gear in the valley. But he's done a lot of different things. He was also a professional alpinist. We have no pets. My kids would desperately love a dog. I would like to have a dog, but I would like to have someone else to help take care of it. But they have kind of recognized that the lifestyle we live is not compatible with really having pets. We tried goldfish. That went pretty badly. Plants usually goes pretty badly. We usually plant a garden in our yard that becomes a forest, and whatever survives is what we eat when we come back. I have all those ambitions to have chickens and a dog, but I just don't know if that's ever going to happen.
Yeah.
We have a big chalet that my husband built us, and we live a couple kilometers outside of Chamonix in a quiet little neighborhood with a bunch of other families.
Yeah, and I guess being outside so much and with the garden and stuff, you get some of that interaction with the wildlife that maybe other people in a city have to, sort of bring the wildlife indoors with them through a pet or something like that. you just mentioned your husband being a mountain guide as well. You kind of just hinted at this in your last story of like you wanted to go rock climbing and your kids wanted to eat rocks, like pick berries. Like, how much of your family experience is guided by the things you and your husband want to do, and then how much do you learn and adapt what the kids want to do? And was there a point where that transitioned, where they kind of like caught up to your ambitions of the things you guys wanted to do?
It's like, I would say it's always evolving. I mean, I was talking to someone about something the other day about a book, and she just said, I really love the phrase that I accidentally fell in love with my kids. Like I didn't have intentions to love my kids or like want to spend all this time with them. I thought we were trying to find a way to get off the hardcore alpinism path and kind of stay alive. And that for me was having a family and doing something bigger than myself. And I had signed up Matthias, my older son, for daycare at a month old. And I was like so ready to go back to climbing in my mind, at least when I was pregnant. And I remember the first day I dropped him off at daycare, and we went and did a rock climb, and I cried the whole time and went back and was like, I just don't want to do this. I'm not ready to do this. So that was a long time of accepting myself. Like that was actually relatively disappointing to myself. The other side, the pre-mom me, didn't want to be that mom in my mind. And then accepting that I actually did want to be that mom was kind of hard. But then we tried doing rock climbing. We always did stuff. My husband bought a bigger van. We had a smaller van. When Mika was born, we went to Australia with Matthias when he was 5 months old. We flew 25 hours. Again, it was a total disaster. There was like baths and sinks in Dubai and McDonald's handoffs with jet lag. And we went kite surfing and rock climbing. And I got bit by a paralyzing tick while I was breastfeeding and went to the hospital. They're like, wait, you can't breastfeed. We were out in the middle of nowhere. We found babysitters at like a gear store and then left him with the babysitter so we could go rock climbing. And then I was like, if something happens, you can call my mom in America. I mean, it was so over the line. But in the end, it was kind of like, to me, I guess, 1970s parenting, which is so liberating in so many ways. But we did have to adapt because as they got a little older, they didn't want me up the wall, and rock climbing was horrible. So I would try and climb, and the photo in the trailer where Mika's on the toilet, that was like real. Every time we'd go rock climbing, I would be clipping bolts and he would have to poop, and they would cry because they were sure I was going to die. And I just was like, we got to stop. This is not fun. So we started kite surfing a lot, which worked really well because we could like tag team and take turns. And the kids loved playing on the beach. And I don't think it was till they were a lot older that they realized there were beaches where the wind wasn't blowing and like the sand wasn't ripping your face off. But they loved kite surfing and the van trips because we were always in these like wild places. We went to Cape Verde when they were little, and they would go grocery shopping by themselves. They were like 5. They would hail taxis. We were in the back of like pickup trucks on dirt roads, things you can't do in France or America. And they thought it was awesome. So we just had to learn to find things that we could all do together. And then we would expose them to stuff like climbing and skiing and snowboarding, but they had to want to do it. They're both snowboarders, and my younger son, Mika, is like going to the Olympics in his own mind, And, I didn't want my kids to be snowboarders. Like, I'm a mountain guide, I'm a skier, but they love snowboarding. So you kind of have to like let go of your expectations of what they're going to do and then be willing to find differences. I also think it's really important to let go of certain things. And I just was no longer willing to spend 8 or 12 or 15 hours a day in the mountains to stay at the level I was at and not be giving some of that time to my family. So I found trail running. We have become an avid skateboard family, which is relatively hysterical. I had a skate class with a bunch of moms today holding hands with a coach, but just finding other ways to enjoy the outdoors. And they really love hiking with us. I wrote an article that was a really nice project with Yeti on finding refuge and talking about going to huts with them. So I guess the positive side was that both me and my husband are kind of open to change, and my husband is the kind of guy who like finds a new passion, he's all in. Like, he's an awesome skateboarder and he started at 45. Right now he's surfing. He's good at everything. and everything he does like 250%. And so he got really good at skateboarding. Now he's working on surfing, he's like training for it. But now the kids are all in and they want to do it all too. So we skate as a family. We go climbing again now because the older one can go. We go ski touring, split boarding, all this stuff. They're in, but you got to go with what they want to do. You can't push it.
Yeah, that is hilarious, especially your husband becoming an awesome skateboarder at 45. I'm not sure
Seriously.
that was in anyone's plans, but thinking about being a mountain guide, I mean, I have a limited amount of climbing and that sort of venturing exposure. Like thinking about being a mountain guide and then being a parent, I mean, a lot of what you're talking about seems to be similar in terms of like adaptability, and you can't control the kid the same way you can't control like a mountain or the weather conditions. So like, is adaptability like just like a really big part that you've been able to transfer over between those two domains?
I think that one of the things that mountain guiding and alpinism taught me is that as long as you're not going to die, suffering ends. And so it's the same with kids. Like when you're on a 25-hour flight or you're having the worst day of your life, it's going to end. It's going to start over tomorrow. So like you can make your way through all that suffering or the challenging situations. And there's always a plan B, and then it's like, if something isn't really bad, is it really that bad? Is it really that bad to be dirty or cold or have a blowout in a diaper? I did a ton of solo traveling and it seemed like every time we were going to board an airplane, somebody pooped through their diaper. But, I would like trust strangers and with one kid because probably they weren't going to leave the airport with them. You just have to be open to, letting people help you, which was a big thing for me to learn. Because as a female mountain guide, I really wasn't allowed to have that vulnerability of being like scared or weak or need help, which is normal for everyone. But I think I had to learn that with kids was that sometimes, because I did a lot of traveling with them by myself and there were a lot of moments that were not easy. But I do think that the whole idea of adaptability, comes from guiding and it plays to my strengths. I like juggling a lot of balls. And I like the intensity of like projects and like every day with kids is a project. You just got to figure out how to make all the pieces work.
It's super interesting. And one of the other things that we see in the film series is your kids learning. I think they asked for dirtbag training. And it actually turned into like a great example of how to communicate the value of things versus experiences, but even just the value of like going to the grocery store and having to buy groceries. So are there any other things that you're sort of pulling through from your time in nature and as a mountain guide and as a climber and alpinist that you're now imparting to your kids maybe in unexpected ways, like the dirtbag training?
Well, I mean, the dirtbag training, there was basically one day we were in Marseille with the kids in southern France on, a multi-sport trip. And my husband looked at the kids and said, the best thing we've ever done for you is take you all over the world. And the worst thing we've ever done for you is take you all over the world. Because you actually think this is normal. Like you think you get to do this. And when you're older, you're going to have to pay for it. And that's where the idea of the dirtbag, like what is a dirtbag? So we were on a trip in Hood River, skateboarding, kite surfing. And, at the end of the trip, they were asking a lot of questions. My kids are really curious and they're like, well, how does that work? Like, how does being a dirtbag work? And so the conversation started about trying to spend the least amount of money and live the most adventure. And it's all about priorities. And so I've always, since they're little, talked about the idea of when you buy something, it costs money, but it costs nature. So everything we consume actually consumes nature inevitably, whether it's food or buying things. So when we buy things we don't need, we spend money and then we have to work to get it back. And then we do less adventures. And then we waste nature because it takes nature to build everything. So I think that lesson was already there. And then it was my husband's idea to take them on this dirtbag adventure. That was, to be honest, the second one they went. The first one they came back with like 13 euros and 35 cents. And it was a really good lesson because on every trip after that, they were like, wait a minute, we just spent all this money and we don't need it. I think they were not lessons we sat down as a couple and were like, let's teach our kids these things. But kind of through the experiences, it was like, what values do we want them to have? And for me, it was valuing life and time over money. And that doesn't mean to say I hope they actually end up dirtbags. Like we want them to go to college and have an education. School's important in our house. But what are the things that make you happy and what makes you feel good? I think the other lesson that comes out in the third episode is giving back and engaging in your community and giving them a voice and knowing they can have a voice as environmental activists. And Matthias was in Iceland with me on a work trip recently on a impact camp with Patagonia to protect the ocean's ecosystems from open pen salmon farming. And he spoke in front of 30 people about his Cookies for Climate project and what his goals are and how he wants to inspire other kids and action. So I think there's a lot of things that have inadvertently come out of a lifestyle choice, but it reminds me that if they're teaching me to make the right choices because I want to show them what's important, and so then the lessons come out in that. So maybe they're also making me better at it too because it helps me like hone in my priorities. Because if I'm gonna preach it, I have to live it.
Yeah, no, now you have to be the example, like sort of 24/7 in a way that you didn't before you were a parent. So you just mentioned Cookies for Climate as a reference. And I think it's really interesting because my 40 years on the planet, like every generation they say is the one that's going to do something about climate change. They're going to be the ones that inhibit biodiversity loss and reverse that course. Like you've mentioned that, there weren't necessarily certain lessons that you wanted to pass along, but I think by your lifestyle, there were certain things that have been passed along to your kids, like establishing this relationship with nature pretty early. I mean, you just talked about some of the adventures where they're less than a year old being out in these places. Do you think that's actually more important for parents, whether they're mountain guides or not, to help establish that relationship with nature quite early? Because one of these generations is eventually going to have to be the one that actually gets us over the line, right?
Yeah. So if we back up a little bit, this goes back to when I was in my 30s. I had this crisis of like, what does an old crusty mountain guide do for work and how do I set myself up for that time in the future? And I went back to school, got a master's from Harvard through the extension school, but while traveling in environmental management and sustainable development. And that was kind of inspired by the relationship I had with Patagonia and Yvon Chouinard's work. And so I knew I wanted to do something with that, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do with it. And once the kids were born, I started working more with Patagonia on environmental projects and managing projects for them. And the kids were able to come on those projects, a lot of those trips with me when they were young. So they were exposed to that conversation. And like you said, we just spent a ton of time in nature. We tried to start a school here. It didn't really work. It's just too rigid of a system and it's too expensive where we live. And so we decided to start a nonprofit that's called Explore, and we run nature classes and forest school. And it's basically just like freaking feral kid time in the forest. I don't know if Matthews remembers the story, but one time I came down and they were all dressed in leaves. Like they had taken off all their clothes and built clothes out of leaves and twine, and we're going to like sell this, and they're playing like a conch shell and they're covered in mud. And this was just the most magical experiences of their life in these classes, like so liberated. But on the other side, I think maybe it's a good thing they ended up in a traditional school so they can function in society as well. So it goes both sides. But they got introduced to this idea of having a voice through the work I did with Patagonia and the travel I did with Patagonia. And Matthias always wanted to do a lot. Mika wanted to do more on the social side. He's more touched by people and their suffering. And Matthias is really aware of both things, but he's really focused on climate change. And so when he was 6 years old, we had a climate protest, and he baked cookies and exchanged them for donations. And he got a bag of like 170 euros in coins. And then we went to Amsterdam to meet Yvon Chouinard because he was there. I had already met him through Patagonia, but I wanted the kids to remember him. And he gave him the bag of coins and was like, I just read Robin Hood and I want to steal from the rich and give to the environment. And
that's awesome.
Yvon took him up on stage and allowed him to talk about it, what he wanted to do. And then they doubled the money, and then Patagonia Europe tripled the money, and then he got to pick where the money went. And that was a lesson for him that like he had power as a 6-year-old. And so this kind of kept evolving, and this is what evolved into Cookies for Climate. And for me, in my master's thesis, I studied The Last Child in the Woods by Richard Louv, which is like about nature deficit disorder. And so to me, there's two very strong paths to healing the planet. One is politics, and the other is society, like people, humans, morals, priorities changing. And I think they should happen at the same speed, really. I mean, politics is so slow. and I am just supremely too ADHD and impatient. I'm legit ADHD, neurodivergent, and I can't deal with politics. So it's not my thing. But people and community building and change is very powerful, and it really works for me. So it's like, okay, if we have all these people working on political change, what if I focus on human change and we just start with the generation and connect kids to nature, and then the values will be there. So I remember coming back from an event about hydroelectric in the Balkans, where they were building all these dams that didn't need to be built, that were destroying ecosystems. It was a lot of corruption. There's a lot of stuff going on, and Patagonia was working against that development. And Matthias asked me to pull over on the side of the road so he could look at the rivers, because they weren't going to be there when he was older. Wow. Like, they got it. They felt it, because that was like their happiest place, is being in those spaces. So it was really natural. I mean, so the long answer back to that question is, you build the connection, you're automatically going to value it. I think we're lucky and very privileged to live where we live and be, middle class and have the finances to do all this stuff, and not everybody has it. So I feel grateful for that. But the more people can expose their kids to nature, even if it's the little flowers that are growing in the cracks, the bugs, the trees, the parks that are in cities, it's there if you can get them to it. I think that builds that need to protect it.
Yeah, I 100% agree. So is there, you've mentioned a few things here, but maybe just to kind of put a fine point on it, like, are there any specific things that you've picked up or learned from your kids' experience that maybe you've either brought into your community building work, your work as as an advocate? Like, is there anything you've learned from your kids that you now kind of take on board and operate as your own almost?
I think the one thing I learned from them is, like, really stopping being judgmental about the size of your impact or what people are doing and how they're doing it, and that we actually just need to validate every action and idea and thought that people have in the right direction and support that, because with that makes growth, right? So if you do something little, you can do something bigger and then do something big. I think that there's so much negativity and judgment over what the right path is that it just prohibits people from getting involved. I shot for a big project in Citizen Energy, was working with the town, got supremely frustrated, and then backed it off and supported Matthias and the Cookies for Climate project, and we planted 45 fruit trees in the valley, and that just felt like I did something bigger than what I was hoping to accomplish initially, because I've created a human that's going on the right path, So I think that they've taught me to just back off a little bit on that, judgment of value, and understand, like, we're not going to get more people in if we're not inclusive and validating everybody's thoughts and fears and means, right? Not everybody has the time or the means to do things on a huge scale. So Yvonne said, if you don't have time and you got money, just open your wallet, because you can give money. Like, that's a valid thing. If you don't have time or desire to volunteer and you do have the means financially, it can affect change. So I think that's, working with them taught me that kind of inadvertently.
And I think part of that too, that, celebrating, validating all these actions across the scale, as long as they're, doing good, as long as they're pointed in the right direction. I mean, part of that, people talk about sort of the damage that can come and from comparison that's fueled by social media, both for kids and parents. Like, as a parent, but also as someone involved in, like, community organizing and helping build that capacity. How do you think about social media? Like, is it something that can fuel, like, we can harness and fuel for both, building that capacity and putting people in the right direction? Or do you think there's, like, just some fundamental challenges with it that maybe it doesn't serve the need for what your aims are, either as a parent or a community organizer?
I mean, I fully engage in social media, and I absolutely do not let my kids. Somewhat hypocritical, and they're all over it. I had a conversation recently with a friend who's like, I can't believe how much you put your kids out there on social media, but that was kind of our life from the start, as, someone who decided to accept a public world as a professional athlete or to make a story about my family. I feel like those stories can be impactful and helpful to people. I think it's really important to be transparent, and I think that was the goal in the disaster style parenting is that I've seen a lot of family films about people that are just so inaccessible, and it just kind of paints this rose colored picture. And for sure, what we do is pretty high end because we have the skills as, mountain guides, and because we have the means and all these things. But on the other side, I feel like we painted an honest picture that it's not always fun and it's not always easy. And I think that can be helpful. I think there's a lot of community building that happens through social media. Do I think it's necessary? I don't necessarily think it's necessary. There's a lot of, people I've met recently in their 20s and 30s who have not engaged in any way in social media. And I'm like, hell yeah, I hope my kids go that way. They're not unhappy. They don't have limited opportunities. One of the photographers that I was working with recently, they didn't have social media. Like, there's other ways to go about it, but I think the foundation or the fundamental basis of social media is not really good. It's not focused on change. It's not focused on inspiring people. It is really that comparison of feeling less than and feeling inadequate. And it's just a waste of time. I do it too. I waste a lot of time. I could be outside running.
Yeah. That's what I noticed. Like in the films, your kids aren't really on screens, but it almost feels like it's partially because you've given them a better alternative. Like you've given them all these activities and things to do that they don't necessarily obsess over, like having an iPad in their hands.
Yeah, they have screens. We're not a no screen house. Like they do have screens, and it is a battle. Mika is someone who kind of naturally is not drawn to it. He just doesn't engage. Matthias finds it probably a little bit harder. He's also ADHD, and there's that like dopamine thing. When we talk about this, we're pretty open. He's open with his neurodivergence, so I'm not crossing any lines with him. But we talk about why he needs to learn to control it. I mean, I have the same battle, but when we are in those outdoor situations and when we're spending our time doing that, then it becomes something they don't even think about anymore. And on trips, for the most part, I just, it's just gone. They don't need to be talking to people. They don't need to be doing things on whatever, device. We watch some movies as a family at night, but it's generally not there that much. I don't know if it's really because of my morals or more because I just get so frustrated by the battle, and I get frustrated by technology because I'm not good at it at all. So it's like I'm going to spend 2 more hours figuring out how to block that thing or limit that thing or whatever. But I just do think that it is a waste of their brain space. And we didn't grow up having that on our mind. It causes a ton of social anxiety for me and them. It's all of us. Matthias just dropped WhatsApp. He was on WhatsApp and with a bunch of friends. And when we went to Iceland, he had conversations with adults and people he really respects, and activists and photographers, and one of our surfers, Ramon Navarro, like really just talked him through what is important in life. And he's like, I don't need WhatsApp. I don't need validation from all my friends. They're my friends. They'll be my friends. It is like a ticking time bomb for every parent and every kid. And, all in, all out. I don't know the answer, but for me, it's just like there has to be, when we go in the mountains and all that, it's just not there anymore. And that's kind of my happiest space.
You mentioned how you sort of accidentally fell in love with your kids. As they start to get a little bit older, do you think there's going to be a point where it's hard for you to let them go out and adventure on their own? I mean, it sounds like they're doing some of that already, but like, is there a little bit of a pool now that you've integrated them into your lifestyle that when they go out on their own, it might be tough?
Yeah, there's 2 things. One is, even though I've spent a ton of time and want to spend a ton of time with my kids, I also feel really grateful and in some ways relieved when they make space between us too, because I can feel suffocated by the intensity of our relationship, even from my side, because I'm super intense. And when I go in, I'm like all in, and it's sometimes just too much. I'm also the accidental super mom. It's not because I want to be. It's just because everything I do is just like my husband. It's like way too much. But watching them pull away in a good way means that we're doing it right. Mika's at a snowboard camp this week by himself with people he doesn't know, with coaches I don't know, up on a glacier, and he's 11. And he called me this morning and was like, we're going in skiing powder and I don't have a beacon, shovel, and probe. What should I do? And I was like, wow, those are good questions, you know? I was like, well, the coaches are not going to take you in that terrain. You're going to stay on the piste and you're doing the freestyle park and stuff. But he was concerned, but it was a good question. So like, I feel like they're learning to do things on their own. They're now going on the mountain skiing with friends on their own. It's terrifying. I'm definitely on like Find My iPhone a lot of the day. Matt has been doing these big trail runs. I definitely follow him on Find My iPhone. He does like solo road biking. I'm like on Strava tracking him. I do not find it relaxing, but I guess like my mom, Matish wants to plan a solo hike, like bivouac and do like multiple days of hiking. He's 12. He'll be 13 soon, but my mom was like, are you really going to let him do that? And I was like, is he really safer riding his bike into town next to cars? Like, I think we also have to be realistic about risk. We convince ourselves that we're safe in our daily life because we're used to the risks we take. And we convince ourselves that it's not safe to let our kids do these other things. But if you give them the skills and they build the skill set, then they're going to be safe and they're going to make the right decisions. Like the phone call from Mika showed me that he's hearing me. Matthias like winter camps in the yard, in like -13, and he's learned all the lessons. He froze all the water. He had cold feet. But he can come inside. So I feel like we've given them the opportunity to build the skills, but it's still terrifying. We're still not sure like what that summer solo hike is going to look like. I'm pretty sure I'm going to be like a couple feet behind him, far enough that he can't see me.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm a normal mom. I find it terrifying to let go of my kids and let them make their own choices. But I think I'm equally terrified by social pressure and getting into an age where, they're adolescents and they're tempted by all sorts of new things. And that's equally terrifying. Driving a car. I mean, that's way more terrifying than a solo hike to me.
Yeah, no, I mean, especially given all the skills you've imparted to them, I think that they definitely have a leg up in that area. So, sort of bring our conversation to a close. Is there anything as a parent during this process, parenting disaster style, that you'd do differently, or things that like didn't work out that you were sure that you would work out? Like, is there anything you would recommend changing or not trying for people?
Oh, I mean, I think if you do that, it's like not productive to do that because it's all part of the process. I mean, I've messed up so many of our days, whether it's being like over motivated or having FOMO and that's like the wrong reason to do what we're doing, or just doing way too much, learning how to be comfortable at home. You have to figure out the balance. I think it's important. I guess the thing I would not do is I would not have mom guilt. I would not have had that because I feel like it took me a long time to get to a place where I was comfortable with choosing myself. And my kids value that. They're really proud of me for all the things I'm doing or the work projects I'm doing. And I was not really good at that when they were younger. And I don't know, I think I would just try and be gentler on myself, and know that it was all okay and it was going to be okay. There's a lot of, I think parents, moms and dads put a lot of pressure to make it all right. None of it's right. I have a journal. I'm sure that their future therapist has all the trauma in it, all the times I lost the plot or whatever. I think the biggest thing I have learned from all that is repair. Because, it's about learning to say sorry and telling your kids you're not doing it right either. I'm a very fiery, emotional, neurodivergent human being with neurodivergent kids, and putting ourselves into really stressful and intense situations. It doesn't always go well, but you can say sorry and you can learn to do better. And I think that teaches them the same. But I think I've also learned a lot to like let go of my ego and be more comfortable. I feel like I wish I could have been this age when they were born and I would have been way more comfortable with letting go. But it's hard, having kids in your 30s and having had that career, wanting to keep going. I was stuck for a long time in the middle. But no, this is a good phase now. I think my biggest advice to people is like, be gentle to yourself. Yeah, for sure I could have done a million things better, but everything we did, if you can learn from it, then it's going to be okay.
Awesome. Well, this has been fantastic, super enlightening. Thank you so much, Zoe, for joining us on the podcast today.
Thanks a lot.